Sign it. My stepfather shoved the papers across the white-clothed table so hard that a champagne glass tipped over beside them. 24 investors stood around the ballroom, watching Chloe's company logo glow across a massive screen behind us. Moments earlier, they had been applauding her launch. Now every face was turned toward me. I looked down at the signature page. "This isn't the agreement I reviewed," I said. "The ownership clauses have been changed." Richard Collins kept smiling, but his eyes went flat. My mother stepped closer. "Maya, don't embarrass your sister tonight." Chloe folded her arms. "You always have to make everything about you." I pushed the pen away. "I'm not signing altered documents." Richard's fist struck my face before anyone moved. Pain exploded through my nose. I hit the edge of the table, then the floor, blood spilling onto the cream carpet beneath me. Gasps rippled through the room, but nobody stepped forward. I reached for the fallen papers. Richard brought his shoe down on my wrist. A crack shot through my arm. I screamed. He leaned over me, while security remained frozen near the ballroom doors. "Sign the papers," he hissed, "or you're done." What Richard did not understand was that I had spent my entire career noticing what powerful men tried to hide inside harmless-looking documents. I was Maya Bennett, 33 years old, a corporate compliance attorney, and the person who had built the legal structure behind Chloe's new company. The investors believed Richard had funded everything. Chloe believed the business belonged entirely to her. My mother believed I was bitter because I had refused to join the family celebration. None of them knew I had already found missing disclosures, conflicting ownership records, and financial transfers that Richard could not explain. I pulled my phone from my pocket with my uninjured hand. Richard laughed. "Who are you calling? The police?" I dialed a number I had memorized months earlier. When the voice answered, I gave one file reference number and said, "The contingency has occurred. There are witnesses." Then I ended the call. Richard straightened, still smiling. Chloe pointed toward the door. "Get her out before she destroys the launch." I pressed my broken wrist against my chest, looked directly at Richard, and said, "You should enjoy the rest of this week." The emergency room doctor reset my wrist before dawn. "You're fortunate," he said gently while studying the scans. "Another angle and you'd probably need reconstructive surgery." I nodded without saying much. Pain wasn't unfamiliar to me. Richard Collins had taught me years ago that pain faded. The dangerous part was believing people would protect you when it mattered. They usually didn't. Richard married my mother when I was 14. At first, everyone called him generous. He paid bills my late father had left behind, bought us a larger home, and quickly became respected throughout the city. He donated to charities, sponsored community events, and knew judges, developers, and politicians by their first names. Inside our house, he ruled differently. Disagreement became disrespect. Questions became disobedience. Silence became survival. Whenever I challenged him, even over something small, he'd lean close enough that nobody else could hear. "You always think you're smarter than everyone else." Eventually, I stopped arguing. I studied harder instead. If I couldn't beat men like Richard through shouting, I'd do it with knowledge. That decision carried me through law school and eventually into corporate compliance. Ironically, it also brought me right back into Richard's world. 2 years before the launch party, Chloe arrived at my office carrying a rough business proposal. "I don't trust strangers with this," she said. "Will you help me set everything up?" Despite everything between us, I agreed. I drafted governance documents, built compliance procedures, reviewed investor disclosure requirements, created ownership protections. I charged almost nothing because she was family. For months, Richard praised my work. "This is why lawyers matter," he'd say in front of clients. Then something changed. About 6 months before the launch, Richard began appearing at my office without appointments. "I've got a few revisions," he'd say casually. The revisions always involved reducing disclosure requirements or changing ownership language. They're only administrative cleanups. They're not, I replied. The investors don't need every technical detail. They legally do. His smile would disappear for a fraction of a second before returning. You worry too much. No, I answered quietly. That's literally my job. After that, every meeting became colder. The first real warning came during a routine document review. 2 financial statements listed completely different ownership percentages. Several investment transfers referenced companies that weren't disclosed anywhere else. A consulting payment had no supporting contract. Individually, each inconsistency could have been an honest mistake. Together, they formed a pattern. I didn't accuse anyone. Instead, I requested clarification. Richard called me within an hour. Stop digging, he said. I'm verifying compliance. I said stop. His voice carried something I hadn't heard before. Fear. Not anger. Fear. I began quietly preserving records exactly as they existed. Every approved draft. Every email. Every signed amendment. Every meeting note. I stored certified copies through proper legal channels, making sure the chain of custody could never be questioned. I never told Richard. I never warned Chloe. I simply kept doing my job. The more documents I reviewed, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. Someone was trying to rewrite the company's history. I contacted an old colleague named Daniel Foster, a former financial crimes investigator who now advised compliance attorneys. We met at a small coffee shop after work. I slid several anonymized documents across the table. He studied them silently. Finally, he looked up. Whoever prepared these revisions isn't cleaning up paperwork. I thought so. They're creating a different legal reality. What should I do? He leaned back. Don't accuse anyone. I wasn't planning to. Good, because if you're right, confrontation only teaches them what evidence you already have. I stared at the folder. So I wait. You prepare. Over the following weeks, I created one final safeguard. If anyone attempted to force my signature through threats, coercion, or violence, a trusted federal investigator assigned to financial crimes would immediately receive authorization to open a sealed compliance package I had legally deposited months earlier. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. Richard never knew it existed. 3 weeks later, Chloe called. You'll be at the launch party, right? Of course. There'll also be a short family meeting afterward. What kind of meeting? She hesitated. Richard says it's time to settle a few ownership questions. My stomach tightened. Ownership questions. After months of pushing altered documents. After growing increasingly desperate every time I refused shortcuts. I thanked her, ended the call, and looked at the calendar. For the first time, I wasn't worried about paperwork. I was worried about what Richard believed he had to lose. What could possibly make a man risk forcing legal documents in front of 24 investors unless everything he had built was already beginning to collapse? NCE doors closed behind me. The launch party had already fractured. Several investors had quietly left. Others remained inside the ballroom, demanding explanations from Richard, while photographers hired for Chloe's event awkwardly packed away their equipment. But before any of that happened, the room had watched everything unfold. When I refused to touch the revised agreement, Richard looked around the room with practiced confidence. I'm sorry everyone has to see this, he announced. Maya has always struggled with accepting that this company belongs to Chloe. A few investors exchanged uncertain glances. One of them asked, "Is this a family ownership dispute?" Richard nodded immediately. Exactly, nothing more. My mother stepped beside him. She's been jealous ever since Chloe's business started attracting attention. I stared at her. She couldn't even look me in the eye. Chloe crossed her arms. You've criticized everything from the beginning. I criticized missing disclosures, I replied calmly. You always find problems. Because they're there. Richard slid the documents toward me again. Let's finish this privately. I picked up the top page. The language had been rewritten. Entire ownership provisions were different. Disclosure certifications had been replaced. Authority clauses transferred responsibilities I had never agreed to surrender. I slowly looked back at him. This isn't an administrative update. His smile tightened. It is now. No. Several investors leaned closer. One woman quietly asked another, didn't their attorney prepare the original structure? I believe she did. Richard noticed the conversation immediately. He laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. See, this is why lawyers complicate everything. A few nervous chuckles followed. Then I held up the agreement. This version removes required compliance certifications. Silence. It also changes who approved prior financial disclosures. Another silence. One investor frowned. I thought those documents had already been finalized. They had, I answered. Richard stepped between me and the guests. That's enough. No. I kept my voice steady. These aren't corrections. They're revised operational documents. They're altered legal records. The room went completely still. Richard's composure vanished. Without warning, he drove his fist into my face. The impact sent me backward into the table. Champagne crashed across the floor. Someone screamed. Before I could regain my balance, his shoe slammed onto my wrist, pinning my hand against the marble flooring. Pain exploded through my arm. Sign it, he shouted. I said sign it. For a second, nobody moved. Security looked toward the event manager. The event manager looked toward Richard. He owned the venue. No one wanted to challenge him. I pulled my hand free and let the papers fall untouched beside me. Blood dripped from my nose onto the signature page. I reached into my pocket with my left hand. Richard laughed. Oh, this is priceless. He looked around the room. She's calling for sympathy now. I ignored him. The call connected almost immediately. This is Maya Bennett. A calm voice answered. I spoke only one sentence. File reference C417. The contingency has occurred. There are 24 witnesses. Understood. The line disconnected. That was all. No explanations. No arguments. No panic. Just one sentence. Several investors stared at me. One quietly whispered, "Did she just give someone a case number?" Another looked down at the blood-covered documents. A third took out his phone and began photographing every page lying on the floor. Richard spread his arms confidently. Everyone, please. This unfortunate family matter is over. But nobody applauded. Nobody returned to networking. Conversations had stopped completely. Across the ballroom, a senior investor slowly picked up his briefcase. Without saying a single word, he walked past Richard, stepped into the hallway, pulled out his phone, and called his attorney. By sunrise the next morning, the launch party was no longer the city's biggest business success. It was the city's biggest scandal. The video of Richard striking me had never reached social media, but it didn't have to. 24 investors had gone home and started making calls of their own. Law firms were contacted. Insurance carriers were notified. Board members demanded emergency meetings before any money changed hands. By 9 o'clock, Chloe's inbox was filling with messages postponing funding decisions. One after another. No investor wanted to wire millions of dollars into a company whose launch had ended with its founder's attorney bleeding on the ballroom floor. I was still in the hospital when 2 detectives arrived. One introduced himself. "I'm Detective Alvarez." The other carried a notebook. "We understand there was an assault connected to legal documents." "Yes." "Were you forced to sign anything?" "No." "Did you refuse?" "I did." They asked me to describe everything from the moment Richard handed me the papers until I made the phone call. I answered every question carefully. Nothing more. Nothing less. When they finished, Detective Alvarez stood. "We'll also be collecting surveillance footage from the venue." I nodded. "I expected you would." Richard gave his first public statement that afternoon. Through his attorney, he claimed I had suffered a minor accidental injury after becoming emotionally unstable during a family disagreement. According to him, I had exaggerated everything. He even suggested I had intentionally dropped onto the floor after refusing to cooperate. That version lasted less than 24 hours. The ballroom contained multiple security cameras. Every angle showed the same sequence. Richard striking me. Richard driving me to the floor. Richard stomping on my wrist. No one watching the footage could mistake what happened. My orthopedic specialist completed his report the following day. The fractures matched a crushing impact. The broken nose matched a direct punch. The medical findings aligned perfectly with the surveillance recordings. Detective Alvarez called me personally. "The medical evidence supports exactly what you reported." I understand. There won't be much room for alternative explanations. There never was. Meanwhile, investigators requested every document connected to Chloe's company launch. The original agreements. The revised agreements. The investor packets. The compliance certifications. Everything. Richard's attorneys objected. It didn't matter. The documents had already become evidence. At nearly the same time, the sealed compliance package I had prepared months earlier was lawfully opened under the contingency protocol I had established. Inside were certified copies of earlier filings, preserved email chains, document histories, and detailed notes explaining every discrepancy I had quietly discovered over the previous months. Investigators now had 2 complete timelines. One showed what the company records had originally said. The other showed what someone had tried to change. The differences were impossible to ignore. Banks reacted quickly. Several pending transactions connected to the launch were temporarily frozen while financial institutions reviewed the growing investigation. Escrow releases stopped. Funding schedules were suspended. What had been scheduled as Chloe's biggest business week suddenly became a waiting game. She arrived at the hospital 3 days later. She looked exhausted. "I don't understand," she whispered. "They're freezing everything." I looked at her. "I warned you the documents weren't the same." I thought Richard knew what he was doing." I didn't answer. For the first time, she seemed to realize that I hadn't been trying to destroy her company. I had been trying to protect it. That evening, my mother came alone. She closed the hospital room door behind her. "Maya." Her voice shook. "Please." I stayed silent. "If you withdraw the complaint, maybe we can fix this before it goes any further." I slowly lifted my cast. "This isn't why it's going further." She stared at me. "The investigation isn't growing because I filed a complaint." "What do you mean?" "It's growing because people finally started opening the files." She lowered her eyes. For the first time in years, she had no answer. Across town, search warrants and document preservation orders were being executed. Company servers were secured. Financial records were protected from alteration. Employees were instructed not to destroy emails or accounting files. Richard reportedly became furious when he learned investigators had moved so quickly. According to one of his attorneys, he kept repeating the same sentence. This was supposed to end with one signature. Instead, it had become something far larger. Late Friday afternoon, Detective Alvarez walked into an interview room where Richard and his legal team were waiting. He placed a thick evidence binder on the table. Richard looked at it without speaking. The detective met his eyes and said quietly, "This stopped being an assault case the moment we opened those files." Richard's attorney asked for a recess almost immediately after Detective Alvarez placed the evidence binder on the table. There wasn't much left to argue. The surveillance footage proved the assault. The medical reports confirmed exactly how my injuries happened. Now the investigators were comparing every revised document with the certified copies I had legally preserved months earlier. The signatures matched. The dates did not. The ownership records did not. Neither did the financial disclosures. The timeline spoke for itself. Months before the launch party, I had realized something that refused to leave my mind. Richard never pressured me to lie. He pressured me to sign. That difference mattered. If he could convince the attorney who created the company's compliance structure to approve the altered records, the changes would appear legitimate. Investors would assume the revisions had been properly reviewed. Without my signature, those documents were vulnerable. With it, they could become powerful evidence against me instead of against him. That was why he became desperate. That was why he chose violence. He believed fear would succeed where manipulation had failed. Instead, it triggered the one contingency I had quietly prepared. When I made that phone call from the ballroom floor, I wasn't asking anyone to start an investigation. I was notifying them that the legal condition we had planned for had finally occurred. The sealed compliance package could now be opened. Everything else followed, naturally, through the investigation. Over the next several weeks, the truth unfolded piece by piece. Investigators discovered years of altered investor disclosures. Money had been transferred through undisclosed entities connected to Richard's development companies. Corporate records had been revised after investors signed agreements. Several certifications carried signatures that experts concluded had been forged or improperly copied. The revised ownership papers placed in front of me that night were designed to make those earlier alterations appear properly authorized. They were never about settling a family disagreement. They were about rewriting history before anyone noticed. The emotional collapse inside my family happened far more quietly than the public investigation. Chloe visited me after meeting with her own attorneys. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had stood on stage during her launch celebration. She sat across from me for several minutes before speaking. "You knew." "I suspected." "You were trying to stop this." "Yes." Tears filled her eyes. "I thought you wanted to ruin my company." I shook my head. "I was trying to keep you from building your future on documents that couldn't survive an audit." She covered her face with both hands. "I defended him." "You believed the person who raised you." She nodded slowly. "I should have listened." There was nothing left to say. My mother arrived a few days later. She looked years older. "I kept telling myself Richard knew what he was doing," she whispered. "You signed documents too." "I know." Her voice broke. I was afraid to question him. I understood that fear better than anyone. But understanding wasn't the same as excusing it. "I spent years believing silence would keep this family together," I told her. "It didn't." She cried quietly. For the first time, neither of us tried to pretend everything would somehow return to normal. It couldn't. The legal consequences continued to grow. Richard was arrested on charges related to assault, fraud, forgery, witness intimidation, and multiple financial crimes. Several investors filed civil lawsuits seeking millions in damages. Banks permanently canceled financing connected to Chloe's launch. Business partners terminated agreements they had announced only days earlier. Professional organizations publicly distanced themselves from Richard. The reputation he had spent decades building unraveled in a matter of weeks. My mother's professional standing collapsed after investigators concluded she had knowingly signed false corporate certifications. Although Chloe was never accused of planning the fraud, her company lost every major investor before it officially opened. The launch that was supposed to define her career became the event everyone associated with the investigation. Recovery was slower for me. My wrist required surgery, followed by months of physical therapy. Some mornings, I could barely hold a coffee mug without discomfort. But each week brought a little more strength, a little more movement, a little less fear. During that same period, several investors who had witnessed the assault contacted me independently. None of them apologized with empty words. Instead, they asked whether I would consider advising their companies on compliance and corporate governance. "You were the only person in that ballroom willing to protect the truth," one investor told me. "That's exactly who we want advising us." I accepted. Within a year, I opened my own independent compliance consulting practice. Ironically, the very investors Richard had hoped to impress became the foundation of my new career. This time, my name appeared on the office door. No one could erase it. No one could pressure me into signing something I knew was wrong. No one controlled my future anymore. I sometimes think back to the moment Richard stood over me, convinced that a broken nose and a crushed wrist would finally force my obedience. He believed violence would secure his victory. Instead, it exposed everything he had spent years trying to hide. The day my stepfather tried to force my signature, he believed he was ending my future. In reality, he signed the end of his own.